Wake up. It's the Sleep Unplugged podcast, episode 104, Sleep Deprivation. Get up, wake up. Welcome, everyone, to the Sleep Unplugged podcast. My name is Chris Winter. I'm a neurologist, sleep specialist, and your host for what will be the final episode of Volume 2. Next week's show, episode 105, will be the second year birthday of the podcast. So we'll celebrate then. This will also be the final episode of the Spotify playlist Volume 2. We'll talk about the music influence of the title in a minute. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. If you're a veteran, welcome back. We're glad to have you. If you'd like to get in touch with the show and talk about your own experience with sleep deprivation, you can do so via our Twitter page, Dr. Chris Winter, as well as Instagram, Dr. Chris Winter, TikTok, Bluesky, Threads, etc. We have a YouTube page where we post all the videos of our content. And I've written 2 books called The Sleep Solution, Why Your Sleep's Broken and How to Fix It, as well as The Rested Child. Both talk about sleep deprivation extensively. So it's interesting that we've finally made it. This is the last podcast of the second season, so to speak. And we're just getting to talk about sleep deprivation. We've talked about it here and there within many episodes, but never really dedicated an entire podcast to it. And last week's episode, when we were talking about research coming out of the sleep meeting, there were entire sections about sleep deprivation and sleep inertia. And I thought this would be a good time to touch on it and sort of explore it on its own. For our comments, corrections, criticisms, last week, just a quick correction. When I was talking about my daughter Maeve doing research up at Columbia, she does a lot of research on menstruation, not menopause. I kind of misspoke at one point, so I did want to correct that. And I think we'll have to do a podcast on menstruation and sleep coming up. There was some interesting research coming out of Houston about that. We talked about individuals with heavy menses having a lot more insomnia symptoms than individuals who didn't, which I thought was really interesting. For our comment, there have been so many listener communications to me about sleep deprivation that I was looking back trying to find one, and I really couldn't find just one because they were all sort of the same vein. Hey, Chris, listen to your podcast, really enjoy it. I have some sort of fear that I'm not getting enough sleep, and I wish you could tell me how I could do that, how I could avoid sleep deprivation. I get in bed, it takes me hours to fall asleep, etc. So we kind of fall back into the patterns of differentiating between insomnia and sleep deprivation. So I really wanted to do that, including with the title of the podcast, Get Up, Wake Up, Wake Up. There are a lot of song lyrics that we could have chosen. Boomtown Rats, Up All Night, Can't Sleep, types of things. But I really wanted to leave those for insomnia and really start to paint the picture of sleep deprivation in the minds of listeners, which is one of high degrees of sleepiness. When individuals are deprived of the ability to sleep, it generally results in more difficulty waking up. And so I went with Marvin Gaye's Sexual Healing, the very beginning of the song, Get Up, Get Up, Get Up, Get Up, Wake Up, Wake Up, Wake Up, Wake Up. Because that's what I think about when I think about sleep deprivation. The individual who's pulled a couple all-nighters, sits down to watch the premiere of House of the Dragon, which starts tonight. Really excited about that. And they're out cold. And not only are they out cold, it's kind of hard to wake them up. They're sleeping through things. So I want to paint that picture of high drive to sleep in sleep deprivation and not low drive to sleep. And of course, there's a gray area in between, especially when you start to differentiate between acute sleep deprivation and chronic sleep deprivation. But just wanted to put that out there. So Sexual Healing was off of Marvin Gaye's 17th and final album, Midnight Love. It was the #1 R&B song for a period of time, #3 on the Hot 100. Marvin Gaye was sort of the Prince of Motown. He married Berry Gordy's sister, divorced her eventually. This was the only song that Marvin Gaye recorded, I believe, that actually won Grammys. He won tons of posthumous awards, but he actually won 2 Grammys for Sexual Healing, Best Male R&B Vocal Performance and Best R&B Instrumental Performance. Marvin Gaye was the son of a preacher, and one of the themes of his life was this struggle between his Christianity and Christian beliefs, but also all the songs that really, sort of catapulted him, particularly later in his career, were sort of about, romance and sex and love. And this song was actually written by David Ritz, a friend of Marvin's, because he felt like Marvin had this sort of sexual conflict brewing in him all the time. And it was also a conflict between he and his father, who his father famously killed him during a dispute, I think a day before his 45th birthday. So we talked way too much about the Ramones last week. We're going to get right into the topic of sleep deprivation. But shout out to Marvin Gaye, and we'll put this song. This will be the final song on the Spotify Sleep Unplugged Volume 2 playlist. We'll begin Volume 3 next week. So what is sleep deprivation? Simply put, it's not getting enough sleep. And this becomes problematic, as we've talked about before, because number one, what is enough sleep? And that's really specifically, what is enough sleep for you? And maybe even more specifically, what is enough sleep for you at this point in your life? And the second thing that kind of goes along with that is, are we talking more of an acute sleep deprivation? You went out to a party. This is not something you typically do. You were out much later than you thought you would be. You had to get up early the next day. So you incurred a sleep debt, a small sleep deprivation. Or is this something that is consistently happening in your life? So symptoms of sleep deprivation, grogginess, sort of being disoriented. Back in episode 73 of the podcast, we talked about sleep inertia, that feeling when you wake up that usually lasts somewhere around 30 minutes of being groggy, wanting to go back to sleep, not wanting to get up, finding it difficult to wake up. We talk to patients in the clinic about sleep inertia. Chris, the hardest thing for me is getting up in the morning. The first thing we're going to talk about is, do we think that there's enough sleep happening? Sleep inertia is a normal situation in somebody who is sleep deprived. I go to bed at midnight. My alarm clock is set for 4:30 in the morning. Wow, it's pretty tough for me to get up in the morning. Of course it is, because your body is basically saying, I don't want to start yet. I haven't gotten enough sleep to fuel me through my day. Dampening sensory acuity, mental processing is slowed. We talked about a couple episodes ago within sleep in the military. That was episode 101. Some of the research by Nita Shattuck at the Naval Postgraduate Program. She actually did interesting research that was presented at the sleep meeting in Houston, where individuals would get phone calls during the night. 2 during the night and 1 around the time that they would wake up. And the question was, did the individual accurately understand whether or not they were asleep or awake when the phone call happened? Usually, from our research, if I remember it correctly, they were able to determine when they were asleep pretty well. But for a lot of people, there were times where they actually thought they were awake before the phone call and very much were not. So when you start looking at people who are chronically sleep deprived, their ability to accurately sense wakefulness, sleep, accurately sense their environment, accurately process things cognitively in an efficient and accurate manner becomes very impaired. So you can imagine, as somebody who works for the military, why her research would be really important. There's an impaired motor dexterity as well as that decline in cognitive ability. And this might reduce attentiveness and reaction time. Christopher Jung, I believe he's in Alaska, did a really interesting research project looking at students in Alaska who were taking an anatomy and physiology class either at 7:30 a.m. or at 7:30 p.m. And the study showed that those that were taking it at 7:30 a.m. more likely to be a bit sleep deprived, more likely to fail the anatomy and physiology final, which was a 46.4% failure, versus those who took it at 7:30 p.m., where the failure rate of the final exam was 19.4. So this was sort of associated with both sleep inertia and sleep deprivation in those students who were taking the early class, which often seems to deprive more people. So there's this circulating sort of back and forth with sleep deprivation, but especially with young people, that early classes tend to create more sleep deprivation. We've talked about that before. And the thought is, if we would just push classes a little bit later, several things happen. One, we alleviate some of that sleep deprivation in young people. Number two, we get their wakefulness period more aligned with where their natural circadian rhythm is. And we talked about that last week with the activities in kids who were aligned and not aligned, and kids who were more aligned with their sleep schedule that's more healthy and more sort of synchronized with what they want, did better with physical assessments. Well, Christopher's research is showing that they're also doing better cognitively, which we know that as well too. There was actually a Baylor study that showed that students who were restricted in their sleep to about 5 hours per night very quickly showed worsening in terms of psychometric vigilance testing. And when we talk about sleep deprivation, I thought it'd be kind of fun to look back at historical studies where they sleep deprived people, and they've got the Stanford study where they were, sleep depriving that young guy for Randy. I always forget Randy's last name. Randy Gardner. They sleep deprived him, and the Peter Tripp, the radio disc jockey who did that sleep deprivation experiment. But very quickly it became clear that we don't need to sleep deprive. We don't need to make people stay up all night, night after night, to show these decrements. And that's what this Baylor study is showing, that even reducing people down to 5 hours per night, and I would put the caveat, these are people who probably require more than 5 hours, but reducing them down to 5 hours, very quickly they're able to see demonstrated psychomotor vigilance testing decline. And probably the most famous psychomotor vigilance test is you put the ruler between your fingers, and your ruler is at the 0 mark, and then somebody drops it without telling you when it's going to happen, and you've got to pinch your fingers and catch the ruler. We're slower at catching that ruler, which you can measure on the ruler when we're not getting adequate amount of sleep. And this is that kind of chronic smoldering level of sleep deprivation that a lot of people feel fine for. I mean, I don't go around when I'm sleep deprived thinking, oh, my ruler catching is more like 7 inches today versus 5 inches. I mean, that's a significant difference, but maybe you don't feel that day to day, depending on what your job is. Now, maybe if you're a carpenter, you notice that when you're not getting enough sleep, you hit nails more, or you're dropping things more, or you're mismeasuring things more. You need something within your job to reflect that reduction in that psychomotor vigilance. If you don't have that in your job, you may be fooling yourself into thinking you're doing just fine with fewer hours of sleep. Deficits of spatial memory, reports of heightened subjective fatigue. So this is a really important one. So not only sleepiness. So, how do we measure sleep deprivation? We've talked about the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. To me, that's a very quick, simple, albeit not perfect, measure of an Epworth. Sit down with your partner and look at that with them. How likely is it for you to fall asleep reading a book, watching TV, driving in a car, passenger in a car, sitting quietly during a meeting, sitting quietly after lunch? If the answer is I fall asleep in all those situations, there's a very good chance that you're sleep deprived. Either you're not getting enough time of sleep, or there is something wrong with the quality of your sleep. I think the desire to go to sleep is very high in individuals who are sleep deprived. I think that's a very important one that we should talk about. This idea that if I were presented with the opportunity to sleep, I would take advantage of that opportunity very quickly. It can often be obsessive. I remember when I was in high school working at a hotel restaurant. It was the Sheraton in Roanoke, if you're ever there. So I had several jobs there when I was in high school. I was the bellman for a period of time. I would drive the van and take people back and forth to the airport, mainly pilots and flight staff. The airport was very close to this hotel. I also served breakfast and lunch sometimes in their restaurant. So long and short of it is, I often had to be there very early. And as a high school student, I was not of the opinion that, okay, well, it's 9 o'clock. I really need to go to bed now so I can get adequate amount of sleep and make the drive to this place, which wasn't really close to where I lived. It was probably a 25-minute drive to get there. And I remember times where I would be just overwhelmingly sleepy. I mean, this is terrible. So we served in the area, this big atrium of the hotel, but there was another dining area for dinner. This was more of an informal place. I would go back to the formal place and get in a booth and take little naps when things were slow. I would just hide back there because if you just popped your head in there, it was dark and you'd have to look under the tablecloth to find me. I remember one time being so sleepy, I went to the fire escape, like on the third floor, just on the little platform, concrete platform, and just lay down and took a nap. I was just, I couldn't do it. And I remember sitting down and immediately falling asleep. And I had a pager, so if somebody needed me, they could page me and I would hook it to my collar so it was close to my ear. But it almost became not a choice. Like I'm either going to go to the concrete landing outside of the third floor and take a nap, or I'm going to fall asleep in front of somebody talking to me. I mean, that's how strong that drive was. And I think the other thing that we tend to overlook is mood. Mood is significantly affected by sleep deprivation. And there was a great abstract that was in sleep this year at the sleep meeting this year in Houston. It was called Sleep Loss and Emotion, a systematic review and meta-analysis of over 50 years of experimental research. So this group, I forget where I apologize, I don't remember what it was from, kind of looked at 50 years of research on sleep deprivation and mood and found that it almost universally increased anxiety and blunted arousal. So it made people feel more anxious. Of course it is. You're trying, your body is saying, look, I need more sleep. And if you're not giving it to me, I'm going to have to resort to other measures to maintain vigilance. And the blunted arousal, of course I did, because you're dying for sleep. So you're not the sharpest you can be when you're not getting enough sleep. It was interesting when they looked at that research, depression was slightly mixed. I would say overall, sleep deprivation, especially chronic, would lead to depression. Certainly, acute sleep deprivation or staying up all night can have an antidepressant effect. It's just unfortunately not something that's particularly sustainable. So my guess is that's some of the reason why the depression results were mixed. But I think overall, when you look at the effect of sleep deprivation on mood, it's very poor, as it is in memory. So there was actually a study looking at, I think it was, I don't remember who did it, but it was organic chemistry in performance in individuals who were sleep deprived and or pulled an all-nighter. I think it was out of Baylor. So this Baylor study looked at how well you were doing in organic chemistry classes if you pulled an all-nighter before the test. And generally speaking, the answer was not well. There were a couple of interesting abstracts that came out of sleep this year that I thought were particularly different and surprising and worth mentioning. One was the ability to reassess a negative situation when you're sleep deprived was dramatically impaired when individuals were not getting enough sleep. So it's that sort of perception of our world that somebody says something a little bit negative, sort of you perceive as being a little bit negative, or there's a situation that's negative that maybe as time passes, you think, oh, it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was, or I don't think that person meant anything negative or pointed as I reassess things. That ability to be flexible with our interpretations of things that were negative were significantly impaired in people who were sleep deprived. There was another study looking at pain perception. I believe it was in either mice or rats. I can't remember. But there have been studies in the past showing that people who are sleep deprived tend to have impairments in their ability to regulate pain, and that perhaps a lot of chronic pain conditions could be coming out of individuals who are simply not getting enough sleep. And I think anybody who's gone through periods of time where they're not getting an adequate amount of sleep, their bodies often just don't feel good. I certainly don't when I'm, sleep deprived and staying up late trying to get things. And I find that as I get older, it doesn't take many of those days to create a physiological response of, oh, my body just feels rough right now. So, but by far and away, my favorite research, and I'll stop with this one, was a study that looked at the ability to, and this was again out of Baylor and Penn, the ability to appreciate the beauty of artwork was impaired when we were not getting enough sleep, which I think is fantastic. That our ability to feel beauty, feel wonder and awe when we're looking at paintings and trying to immerse ourselves in an artistic experience. I just recently was up in I was in London, and it was this sort of artwork immersive experience exhibit that we went to where they took paintings and made them come to life, and it was really, really fun. And it's amazing to think that had I maybe stayed up, late the night before, that had a bad flight over, that my perception and my enjoyment of that exhibit may have been lessened because of sleep deprivation. But I just think that when we think of sleep deprivation, what we want to kind of file away in our brains is that there's probably no end to the negative and subtle effects that it's having on our performance, our psyche, our outlook, our optimism, our enthusiasm. All of these things are being blunted by sleep deprivation. So, again, if you're one of those people who's like, well, I hear you, Chris, but I'm doing fine on 5 hours a night. Look how successful I am. Look at all the cars in my garage. Look at all the money in my bank. I think you could be doing better. And that's a tough thing to talk to a successful athlete, a successful individual who's not getting enough sleep, that, once again, you could be doing better. And again, a lot of times they'll point to the fact that I'm sleeping great because every time I get into bed, I'm asleep immediately. And we really want to get away from that speed to unconsciousness as a indicator of a good sleeper, as we have talked about many, many times in insomnia episodes. That speed to unconsciousness, I fall asleep fast every night. I'm asleep before my head hits the pillow. I'm out in 30 seconds every night. That latency, that speedy latency, is often hint number one that you're not giving yourself enough time to sleep, or perhaps there is something wrong with the quality. But we're going to focus mainly on quantity for this episode. So, what are some of the causes of sleep deprivation? School's a big one. School and work are probably number one and number two in terms of obstacles that you would get more sleep, but because of that organic chemistry exam or because of that anatomy and physiology final, you're staying up later to do better at school. Work is another big one, particularly shift workers we know tend to be more sleep deprived than people working the same job, just on a more regular 9 to 5 schedule. The internet was a big cause when you looked at research about sleep deprivation, particularly in young people, that internet and media can be a big one as well too. And finally, I would put in there medical or sleep disruptors, your snoring spouse, pain issues, medical issues, medications that you're taking. These types of things tend to create sleep deprivation in some people as well too. So what are the ways that we can fight back against sleep deprivation? What are things that we can do to make it better? One of the more interesting research pieces that I saw was, could we use light and odor in the morning to help with some of that sleep inertia and some of the signs of sleep deprivation? This was, again, Nita Shattuck and some individuals from Australia. And what she found was no, that novel smells, light in the morning was really inadequate to deal with the effects of sleep deprivation. In fact, in the abstract, it said something like, perhaps the only thing that would really mitigate these symptoms of, sleep deprivation would be napping during the day. And so, to me, probably the biggest way that we can fight against sleep deprivation outside of getting enough sleep at night is the intelligent use of napping during the day. And we've spoken about this quite a bit during the podcast, that if you're somebody who is getting to bed at night and it is a struggle to fall asleep, I think we have to be very careful with napping during the day, because a lot of times the napping will perpetuate that. But if you're like, no, 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 Chris, that's not at all what's happening. I'm getting in bed at midnight after my second job. I'm asleep before my head hits the pillow. I sleep for my 5.5 hours, get up, go to job number one. I do have some time between job number one and job number two that I could either watch TV, play a video game, or take a nap. I think you should absolutely nap. I think that napping can be a way that we can make bad situations better by getting more sleep time per 24 hours. Caffeine results are very mixed. Again, for some people, it's all about trying to mitigate dangerous situations, and caffeine can be helpful. There are medications that are FDA approved for shift work disorder, that are medications that promote more wakefulness despite the sleep disruptions and sleep deprivation of shift work. And once again, light, odor, novel alarm clocks, vitamins. We talked about, in last week's episodes, that in students that may not be getting enough sleep, there weren't really vitamin mineral supplement combinations that were helpful in reversing that. So to me, it's all about controlling the variables that you can control. Are you setting aside enough time every night to sleep? And if you don't have that adequate amount of time, have you built in periods where you can nap? And I think that it's important to understand that sleep professionals can help with these types of things. I mean, these are things that we deal with all the time, where we sit down with individuals. They've got two kids, they're working two jobs, maybe they live by themselves, they don't get a lot of support from their spouse in certain ways. What are some things we can do to take this situation that's an F and maybe move it to be a C minus? To me, goal number one is to make sure that your safety is protected, particularly with driving. I was just talking to a patient last week, and we were kind of discussing things, and I made some comments. She said, "Oh, don't worry, I don't drive. I take public transportation." And I thought, well, that's at least good that we don't have to worry about you falling asleep in traffic, because this individual had nodded off while sitting in traffic some time ago and sort of gently rolled into the persons in front of her, which is very common. Traffic situations bring out the worst in people who are sleep deprived. So, to me, I really want to focus on that feeling of, I can't get up, I can't wake up, I'm extremely driven to sleep, because that's the picture of sleep deprivation, and not the individual who takes them hours and hours to hours to fall asleep. If that's the case, and it's a real perception, there's probably a good chance that you're at least getting enough sleep, that maybe you're not perfect, but hard to make a strong argument that you're sleep deprived when you've got this golden opportunity to sleep every night and you're not utilizing it. That's generally not the way sleep deprivation works. So that's it for this week. Tell me about your remedies, your stories, your history with sleep deprivation, things you used to overcome it when you were in your law clerk days and your medical internship days. What was your sleep deprivation like? Social media, Dr. Chris Winter Twitter, Dr. Chris Winter Instagram. Again, this is the final episode of Sleep Unplugged Volume 2, so to speak. So next year will mark the two 2-year birthday of the podcast, and we'll celebrate then and start a new Sleep Unplugged podcast. You can follow us on Spotify. We have Sleep Unplugged Podcast Volume 1 and Volume 2. I've written 2 books, Sleep Solution, Why Your Sleep's Broken, How to Fix, as well as The Rested Child. Both of those talk extensively about sleep deprivation. Get some sleep this week. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. And until next week, sleep well.